Welcome to the EcoThink podcast, where you join us on a dive into climate change and social justice issues through a STEAM lens. Each episode, we will break down silos, build up amazement, and bring on action. We invite you to follow us on Instagram and Twitter at EcoThink Productions. If you'd like to join the Eco Geeks in supporting this podcast for just a couple of dollars a month, you can do that on Patreon at www.patreon.com/EcoThink. Now let's get on to the show. Seth Klein is the team lead and director of strategy of the Climate Emergency Unit, which is a 5-year project of the David Suzuki Institute that Seth launched early in 2021. Prior to that, he served for 22 years as the founding British Columbia director of the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, a public policy research institute committed to social, economic, and environmental justice. He is also the author of the recently published book, A Good War: Mobilizing Canada for the Climate Emergency, and writes a regular column for the National Observer. Welcome to the show, Seth.
Nice to be with you both.
Yeah, so thank you so much for spending time with us this evening. I know you're a very busy person and you have a lot going on, so we really appreciate it.
Yeah, it's great.
Yeah, so I thought we'd spend a bit of time at the top of the interview getting to know you a little bit more. So would you be willing to tell us more about who you are and your journey as an activist, author, and policy expert?
Oh, okay. Well, there's a lot there.
Yeah.
So I'm originally from Montreal. I come from an activist political family. My parents actually came as Vietnam War resistors. I was conceived in New York and born in Montreal, and my dad got his draft notice in between, and my parents decided to come to Canada. Mm-hmm. Along with thousands of other Americans at that time. Mm-hmm. So that's why my sister and I were born in Montreal. So I grew up mostly there. And when I was a teenager, I mean, in the same way as you've got all these youth climate strikers today mobilizing in the face of this existential threat, when I was a teenager in the 80s, that existential threat was the threat of global nuclear war. Mm-hmm. And when I was 15, I was part of starting a group in Montreal, and that ended up growing into quite a big thing and resulting in spending a year going on a national speaking tour when I was 18, which is the first time that brought me to Vancouver. And that was quite a defining event in my own activism. We spoke to 1 in every 20 high school students in the country that year.
Wow.
It was just before the end of the Cold War. So I mentioned this because there's a bit of an irony with the fact that I've written a war story.
Yeah.
I cut my political teeth in the peace movement. And then went to university. I was active as a student, mostly in the anti-racism movement at the time. Came out here. I was briefly a teacher, and then went back to school and here at Simon Fraser University for a master's. And while I was a student, I was part of these meetings about setting up a progressive think tank in Vancouver. Mm-hmm. And then after I defended my thesis, I was asked to start it.
Yeah.
So I never went back to teaching, even though that wasn't quite planned, but I ended up staying there for 22 years, building this ABC with a great team. And finally, a couple of years ago, decided it was time to try something new.
Yeah, wow. Yeah, it's quite a journey. And like you said, the irony of starting off as a peace activist and then writing a book with a title as kind of almost warlike sounding,
Mm-hmm.
Good War, Mobilizing Canada.
When a friend first suggested that as the title, I was like, whoa, no, that's just too much.
It really catches attention.
But then, I guess it sort of settles in, and I think we landed in a good place.
Yeah.
What inspired you for this book?
Well, so when I left the CCPA, I knew I wanted to concentrate on climate. Mm-hmm. I was feeling increasingly anxious about it. As a parent, among other things, but also the CCPA, the BC office of the CCPA had been doing more and more climate work over the years. And so, that forces you to follow the science. And I'm not a scientist. I just take what the scientists tell me. Mm-hmm. But you can't help but follow that stuff. and become increasingly alarmed.
Yeah.
And at the CCPA, you're forever in this space between what you are convinced is needed from a policy point of view and what our politics seems prepared to entertain.
Mm.
And so when I left, I set on this idea to write a book that would tackle that gap.
Yeah.
How do we close that gap between our politics and the fact that even when we elect, supposedly progressive governments who purport to get and accept the science, they still don't practice a policy agenda that aligns with what the science says we have to do.
Mhm.
And I wanted to write a book that would embolden them,
Mhm.
and challenge them to try to figure out a path through that to tackle that gap. But in the original book outline, there was only going to be a single chapter on the Second World War,
Yeah.
because I had long been intrigued by the World War II as this example of another time when we quickly retooled the whole economy. In fact, we did it twice in 6 years, once to ramp up military production, another time to reconvert to peacetime. And I thought, oh, that's interesting, because so many of us have in the back of our mind this question when it comes to the speed and scale now required, like, can we really do that?
Yeah.
And I thought, all right, this will be a chapter that says to people, yeah, actually we can do that because we have.
Yeah.
But then the more I delved into it, the more I started to see more and more parallels. And they weren't just economic, around how was public opinion rallied? How did we navigate all of the complexities of Confederation? What's the connection to inequality? What did we do for returning soldiers as a model for just transition? How did we pay for it? What was the role of youth? What was the role of Indigenous people? What was the role of civil society? And I also knew, I was meeting with writer friends, and because this is the first time I've written a book after 22 years of writing policy reports, which, they were good,
Yeah.
but they weren't exactly gripping.
Yeah.
And,
Slightly different style of writing.
Yes.
Yeah.
And my writer friends were saying, like, well, first of all, the neat thing about a book is that you have a chance to connect with people's hearts as well as their heads.
Mhm.
And secondly, they said, if you're going to write a book rather than a policy report, you got to have story, you got to have narrative. And in that World War II material, of course, there's so much story and narrative.
Yeah.
So I rewrote the whole plan and decided to rewrite the whole book and restructure it around the war. But the thing that was fascinating about that journey was, first of all, I knew it was a good narrative device. It jolted my own thinking.
Oh yeah.
About how we approach emergencies.
Mm.
Like I've been dealing with the climate file for years.
Yeah.
But it made me look at it differently.
Mm-hmm.
What I've only really appreciated in the 9 months or so since the book came out, and I've been giving lots and lots of talks, is how remarkably resonant this 80-year-old story remains for so many Canadians.
Mm-hmm.
Who have maybe a familial connection or an institutional connection. And so I get this chance to not only engage with them in terms of their head and their heart, but to make a little mischief and to say, these people in your past who are important to you and important to your sense of legacy, let's remember what they did.
Yeah.
This key moment. And here we are again. And who do you want to be?
Yeah. Can you emulate what your ancestors did in that moment?
Right.
Yeah. That's really powerful. And I love how you said that you've been balancing this idea of what needs to be done based on what the science says and what our politicians or political systems seem ready to accept, and how this book is meant to kind of marry the two. Because it did feel, when I was reading it, there was definitely moments in the book where you kind of go, man, like this seems so obvious that we can do this, and we did it in the past, and my grandparents went through World War II, and they definitely did a lot to go through it. And yeah, so it's really interesting to see that this call to action of bringing our politics up to where the science needs to be, or where the science says we need to be, like it is doable. I definitely felt
and
that
I think
while reading it.
It speaks to the fact that while we need the scientists like you both, we also need the social scientists, the historians and the political scientists and the economists. And, when we all kind of wrestle with this question, like, why aren't these politicians who get it actually doing what the science says they have to do? And I think a big piece of that is that they're all, and this is true across the political spectrum. I mean, it's particularly true of conservatives and liberals. It's also true of the NDP and the Greens.
Mm-hmm.
They're all somewhat hamstrung by this 40-year legacy of neoliberalism, which is like a straitjacket on our thinking about what is and isn't possible and allowed.
Okay.
And that has sapped our imagination about what's possible to do together.
So could I ask you to elaborate a little bit? Because I'm sure that there's probably someone listening who's not super clear on what neoliberalism actually is. Could you give a little primer on that?
Yeah, sure. Good question. Well, so at one level, it's a policy agenda of sort of classic liberal economic policies. So free markets, small government, low taxes, low regulation, free trade, free capital movement, that agenda. And you know, that agenda has become very rooted, and again, not just among right-wing parties, also everywhere.
Yeah.
But it's more than just a policy agenda. It's also an orientation about that we can't do great things together through our governments in particular. That in some ways neoliberalism is most famously captured in a line from Margaret Thatcher, who is one of its great advocates, which she said, "There's no such thing as society. There are only individuals and families." And so that speaks to it. And it's also at a more crass level, it's sort of this feeling that only the private for-profit sector creates wealth and jobs. And so if you're a government wanting job creation, the best, you can't do it yourself. The best you can do is attract private investment, right? And so that's been the dominant ideology for the last 40 years.
Yeah.
And it has, so when you know, my book is arguing for some pretty bold, brash, state-led things. And it's saying we're not truly in emergency mode if we're not spending what it takes to win, if we're not creating new economic institutions like public enterprise and crown corporations to get the job done, if we're not moving from voluntary to mandatory measures, meaning use the regulatory power of the state. Why aren't we doing those things? Well, it's because 40 years of neoliberalism has told these governments that those things aren't allowed or possible.
So this is really interesting because when you said the moving from voluntary to mandatory, it immediately reminded me of how BC dealt with the COVID pandemic, this COVID emergency. This is my personal opinion. I thought BC was a little bit too slow in reacting to the pandemic at the very beginning. I feel like we eventually caught up with mandatory face masks and all of the other regulations that were put in place and the entire lockdown. And I wanted to relate this to what you said at the beginning about the parallels of public opinion as well, because a lot of people in BC were not happy with how we dealt with the pandemic. So could you speak a little bit about the parallels you found while writing this book, specifically on the public opinion, because I'm really interested in how the public reacted to, say, the war versus how the public reacted to our COVID pandemic, and how the public react to our climate emergency.
Well, there's actually, in my mind, two separate, equally important questions of what you're asking. There's the public opinion, particularly at the outset of the war, at the outset of the pandemic. But you started off with also a really interesting point about our desire or resistance to mandatory measures. And I want to pause on that for a second. So far, if you look at British Columbia or Canada's greenhouse gas emissions for the last 20 years, they're basically a flat line.
Yeah.
We're not increasing anymore. But neither, to put this in the parlance of the pandemic, we have not bent the curve.
Yeah.
Why is that? I think that's because if you survey all of our federal and provincial climate policies to date, what they almost all have in common is that they're voluntary.
Yeah.
We encourage change, we incentivize change, we give rebates, we send price signals. What we had not done is require change. Now, interestingly, in the war, the most dramatic example of mandatory measures was rationing, household rationing. And initially, the governments in Canada and the UK that brought it in were very worried that the public would revolt. And that's not what happened. In fact, rationing was incredibly popular because, first of all, people felt like it was a way that they could all contribute and that it was fair. Similarly, I think you nailed it, that in the pandemic, you always have this fringe who are like this libertarian fringe, right?
Yeah.
And that was true in the war as well. But in the main, you actually had a public, I think, in the pandemic ahead of the politics saying, make it mandatory, make the mask mandatory, right? And I actually think on climate, people are ready. They want governments to make it mandatory. Why? Because in the main, most of the public want, whether it was the war, the pandemic, the climate, they want to do the right thing.
Yeah.
But it irks them, because nobody wants to be a chump,
yeah.
that they would do the right thing and their neighbor doesn't.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's the thing about mandatory measures. You start to see clear mandatory measures with near-term dates. What 2025, you won't be able to buy a new fossil fuel vehicle anymore. Next year, no new buildings should be able to tie into gas for space and water heating, right? That sends a clear emergency signal, and you're not incentivizing it. You're not trying to encourage it or cajole it. You're saying that's the rule. Now, your other question was about public opinion. And the thing, remember, I wrote my book before the pandemic, but you're right that there's lots of parallels. And it strikes me in those parallels that every emergency begins with a period of denial. Every emergency begins with a period of denial. Right up to the 11th hour in the Second World War, the majority of the public did not want to do this and did not appreciate the way in which their entire society was about to change. And all of us can remember 15 months ago when we started to hear about this virus, but we were all in denial about how this virus was going to upend our lives and change so much. And we're in a similar period of flux on climate. And the question in all cases is, what's that alchemy? What is that combination of events and leadership that shifts the popular zeitgeist and moves us into emergency mode?
So sort of what is going to be our catalyst that sparks Canada to enter an emergency response?
Exactly.
And do you have any thoughts on what that catalyst might be?
For climate? Well, so the curse of climate compared to the war and the pandemic is that it moves in slower motion. And people's, so with COVID, we could remember certain events that happened quickly in succession and moved us all. I remember when they canceled the NBA season. I don't even watch basketball, but I remember thinking, whoa, this is different. But then I know it also took seeing our prime minister in front of his house every morning. That signaled something new and different was afoot. So on climate, here's the good news. What the public opinion polling tells us is that even before the pandemic, over the previous 2 years, there was a real shift in the terrain of public opinion. And to the point that if you now ask Canadians, is climate an emergency? And a majority say yes. So that wouldn't have been true 3 years earlier, right? So people's sense of the emergency has shifted from being somewhere else sometime in the future to here and to now. And the main reason for that is extreme weather events touching people's lives. But inconveniently, we don't all experience the same event, as one thing. They happen here and then here and then here and then here. And then there are these political dynamics, right? The student strikes were key to shifting the terrain of public opinion. But what we haven't seen is our political leadership model emergency mode in the way that we have all become accustomed in the last year.
So that's interesting because I remember reading your book and I loved how at the end of each section, and we're going to make sure to leave a link for everyone to go find your book and read it after this podcast because it is a good book. Everyone should read it.
Thank
After
you.
each section, you give kind of like a footnote, like a list of recommendations of this is how we can take this lesson from World War II and apply it to today with the climate crisis. And these are the steps of what needs to happen in order to make it happen. And I was curious if you'd be willing to share a couple of your favorite recommendations because they're all good. So it might be hard to choose. But yeah, I was just wondering if you'd be willing to share it with you.
Yeah. Well, so I have this whole, I call it my battle plan for the climate emergency. It's 14 key lessons out of the war. So people can check that out on my site too, if they, although by all means read the whole book. I mean, first of all, like I said before, because I've done many interviews like this and you're trying to distill a 400-page book into something bite-sized, I've distilled all of those into what I call my 4 markers of emergency mode, which I said before. Spend what it takes to win, create new institutions to get the job done, move to voluntary, and tell the truth.
Yeah.
But just to elaborate on some of those, like on the new institutions, you know, it boggles my mind that the ramp up of military production in the war was jaw-dropping, right, from a base of almost nothing. And the guy who oversaw all of this in Canada was this fellow C.D. Howe in the Mackenzie King government. He was no lefty, you know, he was just kind of on the right of the cabinet and had made a lot of money in the private sector, but he was in a hurry. He was an engineer, incidentally. He was the only engineer in cabinet. Most of them were lawyers. And anytime the private sector couldn't quickly do what needed doing, he created another crown corporation. He created 28 crown corporations during the war to expedite that production. Justin Trudeau's created 2 new crown corporations, the Canada Infrastructure Bank, and you know what the other one is?
Not off the top of my head.
Well, you're gonna hate. I hate to tell you, it's the Trans Mountain Pipeline Corporation.
Oh, God.
So you know, there's that contrast between what emergency mode looks and feels like, and where we're at right now. But the other, you asked for a second, and I would say this: there is a thread running through the book, which is that true society-wide mobilizations require social solidarity, and that inequality is toxic to social solidarity. That connection between mobilizing for climate and tackling inequality. That was true during the war too.
Yeah.
Canada, the peak of economic inequality in Canada in terms of the share of income going to the top 1% was in 1938, the year before the war.
Wow.
So we entered this war with very unequal society. But the King government knew that if he really, to really achieve mobilization, to get voluntary recruitment at the level that they needed, they had to confront that. So what do? They bring in new taxes on the wealthy, new taxes on corporate tax rates went up from 18 to 40%. And then they had a cap. So the kind of profiteering we've seen in this pandemic was illegal in the Second World War. And then on the flip side, we saw our first major income transfers in the war. Unemployment insurance comes in the war. The family allowance comes in during the war. And then midway through the war, they realized, because the recruitment numbers weren't there yet, it wasn't enough to tell people, you know, go fight these bad guys on the other side of the world. If they were really going to hit the numbers they needed, they had to make a pledge that the society people would come back to would look different than the one they were leaving behind. It would be more just and more fair. That's when they hit the recruitment numbers. And I think you see an echo of that in the appeal, the tremendous appeal of the Green New Deal.
Yeah.
So when I did opinion polling on the Green New Deal, where you give people a definition of it, linking tackling climate with, you know, and audacious job creation programs and infrastructure spending and tackling inequality and the caring economy, the popular support for that goes through the roof. It's dramatically higher than any political party.
Yeah. It would be interesting if we were to see like a Green New Deal party kind of become a thing in the next few years. I don't know if it'll happen, but that'd be kind of
nice.
Yeah, yeah. So that's cool. I think one other question that I had was kind of around this idea. So we talked about how we're dealing with 40 years of this idea of neoliberalism, and that it's the individuals and not society that make change, and we're trying to flip that narrative. And I guess the question that I have for you is still kind of in this neoliberalist mindset, but I do kind of want to ask, like, if someone's listening to this podcast, how can they start to challenge this and become, or like get involved, especially if they are originally not super invested or involved in the political world? Is there a way for them to join the society that's not neoliberalist and kind of moving towards a more mobilization towards fixing this issue?
I mean, so first of all, my hope is that the pandemic experience has helped to undo that straitjacket of neoliberal thinking. Right? Like the Trudeau government spending on climate tallies up to about $5 billion a year. In the pandemic, they were spending $5 billion a week. I mean, it just explodes the scope of what's possible, right? So I think we need to just grab hold of that. But more specifically, in answer to your question, this is a political moment.
Yeah.
Right. And I think, you know, there's a critique in my book of the environmental movement that we've spent too many years individualizing the solutions.
Absolutely.
That's the thing about climate and war. They're inherently collective endeavors. And they have to be state-led. Both have to, what emergencies like those have in common is that the speed and scale required has to be state-led, which inherently means this is a political project. It means how do we mobilize politically? How do we make them feel the heat? How do they know that we're demanding truly bold action? How do we elect squads of true climate champions, or run yourself?
Running yourself, like that's a big call to action as well. Have you ever thought of running?
Well, I don't know if you know, but my wife is Vancouver City Councillor Christine Boyle.
Yes, I have heard. Yeah.
she moved the climate emergency motion in Vancouver 2.5 years ago, which was the first in English Canada. And Vancouver, I think, really has the most, certainly the most ambitious climate municipal plan in Canada. And we have young kids, so one politician in the house is enough. And also, she's much better at it than I am.
Maybe one day we'll be able to interview her if she has time.
Yeah, she's better.
Yeah. No, that's great. So in terms of where to find your work and this book and how to get involved further, I know that you recently launched this climate emergency unit. And I wanted to ask you a little bit more about what that is and where we can find more information on it.
Yes, thanks. So the website is just climateemergencyunit.ca, and you can read more about it. The idea, you know, right as soon as the book was out, I was starting to engage with political leaders across the country, provincially, federally. You know, you write a book, people are happy to meet with you, but really you can only get so far when you're a guy with a book. The follow-up is a bit challenging. And I knew that I wanted to be able to back up. I wanted to spend the next few years animating and advancing the emergency framework and emergency ideas in the book. And that I couldn't just do that as a guy with a book. I needed to have an institutional home again, and a team that could organize campaigns so that, you know, that we would directly lobby politicians, but back that up with mobilization of friends and allies so that they would hear a drumbeat of people saying, we like that idea, we want that. So David Suzuki and Tara Cullis gave me that institutional home with the David Suzuki Institute. And we raised some money to recruit a small team. And we're trying to put together coalitions provincially and sectorally. The neat thing about those 4 markers is that while they were originally intended for federal and provincial governments, you can actually map them onto any sector. So spend what it takes, great institutions, moved from voluntary to mandatory, tell the truth. What does that look like for arts and culture? What does that look like for faith institutions? What does that look like for farming and agriculture? What does that look like for a union? What does that look like for a university? It works. If you want to know if those institutions have truly shifted into emergency mode, use those 4 markers as a lens. But the markers also become a way of sort of brainstorming, okay, for our institution, for our sector, what's that emergency agenda? What's that package of policy sticks and carrots that shows we're serious about this? And we form coalitions of groups that want to work on that agenda, forge that agenda, work on it together. That's the model.
Awesome. And so people can take a look at what you guys are doing and maybe get involved by going to the website that you said before.
Sign up for the newsletter. And then through that, you'll hear about different campaigns as they're unfolding and see which ones you want to get engaged in.
Awesome. And in terms of other work that you're doing, you can also go to sethklein.ca, right, to learn more about you and the book and where to read more about the book and all that kind of stuff as well. Again, I definitely recommend giving it a read. It was very well done in my opinion. So
Before we leave, this might be more appropriate to cut into before the Seth's current endeavors.
Sure.
But this has been running through my mind for a while since we talked about the COVID emergency plan. But for a lot of our younger listeners, and I always have this thought, like how can we present this information to a high schooler? How can we present this information to a middle schooler? Because they are that generation and that demographic is really, really important for us for our future, for any future changes. So these students, they are learning about the war in school. It's part of the social studies curriculum.
Yes.
But it's not something they can relate to
exactly.
personally. But they are able to relate to the COVID emergency. So how would we draw lessons from the COVID emergency and translate that into our climate emergency action plan?
Well, first of all, before you give up on the war there.
Yes.
I mean, because I was fleetingly a high school socials teacher. And so once I landed on this structure for the book, it is certainly true that in the back of my mind was the thought like, oh, finally, I hated learning about World War II. I was like, all right, this book, and I've even toyed with like a YA version of it. That it could make the study of the war newly relevant because of its translation. And I do think there are parts of that story where young people can and should find inspiration in a way that they won't from the pandemic story. In particular, I actually just wrote a piece earlier this week for The Observer on the case for a youth climate corps. A mass program for young people finishing high school to spend 2 years rising to this emergency moment in the field. And if I were 18, thinking right now, contemplating post-secondary education, but knowing what I know about this emergency, I don't know that I'd go to university when the emergency is now. And the interesting thing about that war story is, from a population of 11 million, over 1 million Canadians enlisted. And the one thing that was the single most common characteristic of them was their youth. 64% of them were under the age of 21.
Oh, wow.
Which means that they deferred their university studies, they left their farms, they delayed their work lives and their careers because the emergency was then, as it is now.
Yeah.
So I do think that there is there is something in this story for young people for the present. But as you say, and in all of my, having written the book pre-pandemic, my talks always end up talking a lot about the pandemic. I do think that those are, the whole premise of my book written pre-pandemic was that I needed to excavate this historic reminder of how quickly we can move. Mm-hmm. And here we've all been so quickly moving and changing. And so we should find inspiration in that story too. And you don't have to go far into the historic record to realize it.
Mm-hmm. I'm really excited to recommend your book to all the teachers that I have contact with, because I think your book provides a great framework to teach about the war history, but in a very modern lens, because we are dealing with a climate emergency, even though it doesn't quite feel like we hit that emergency button yet.
Yeah. Can I say one other thing from a teacher perspective? Mm-hmm. So as I was writing, again, once you're a teacher, you can't totally lose it. I kept feeling like there's a bit of a Where's Waldo game in the book of spot the rule breaker. And these people who, in the face of a civilizational threat, defied the rules, defied the norms of their time, and did what they had to do. Mm-hmm. That is inherently appealing to young people, I think. Mm-hmm. And so the book then, at the end of the book, I tried to list and name. Did you notice right through this whole 400 pages, these were all of the rule breakers back then? Mm-hmm. And who are they now? Because we have them again in the present. Yeah. And what would you have done if you'd lived then and there? And who do you want to be today?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's great. Your book has definite potential for a YA version, and
I would read it. I would totally read it.
I very much support that.
You're just trying to avoid reading the 400 pages.
I've already read the 400 pages.
Okay.
I will. It's on my shelf. I'm ready to it. It's Oceans Week Victoria next week, so my hands are pretty tied right now.
By the way, if you want, the very first of these Where's Waldo rule breakers in the book comes up in chapter 2. And he has a relevance to our BC Environment Minister. Mm-hmm. So it's the story of this guy, Shiuni Sugihara. Have you ever heard of him?
No.
Yeah. So few people have. A lot of people have heard of Oskar Schindler, because of the movie Schindler's List.
Yeah.
But Sugihara actually is credited with saving more Jewish lives in World War II. So if you're Jewish in Vancouver, like I am, most of us our families came from back east. But there's a pocket of Vancouver Jews whose families came the other direction, including, interestingly, the parents of George Heyman, our environment minister, our climate change minister. Because at the outset of the war, there were thousands of Polish Jews who were fleeing. And they went to Lithuania and they started going to all of the embassies and consulates. Thousands of them show up on the lawn of the Japanese consul general, this guy, Shiuni Sugihara. Now remember, we weren't at war yet with Japan, but Japan was already allied with Nazi Germany. Mm-hmm. Sugihara cables to the Foreign Affairs Office in Tokyo saying, I got all these people on my lawn, what am I supposed to do? They say, you're to do nothing. And he decides, oh, screw it. And he starts handwriting as many transit visas in a night as would normally happen in a month, and is, as I say, credited with saving the lives of 6,000 Jews who, using his transit visas, travel overland Russia, Siberia, they hadn't entered the war yet, to Japan, and come over the Pacific, not the Atlantic, and land in Vancouver.
Wow.
Very inspirational.
So if not for this guy being a rule breaker, and not just a rule breaker, I mean defying the imperial Japanese government, our environment minister wouldn't be with us.
Yeah. It's those linkages sometimes when you look in history that just blow your mind. Like, what an inspirational man. Yeah. So that is all the time we have for the interview today. I wanted to take another moment to thank you so much for your time. And I'm really looking forward to seeing the response we get from our listeners. And anyone who's listening to this podcast, feel free to comment and let us know what you thought, and see if you can find all of the other Where's Waldo characters before you reach the end of the book. Thank you so much, Seth, for your time today.
Nice to be with you both.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the EcoThink podcast. We hope you enjoyed learning something with us today. EcoThink podcast is an official product of EcoThink Productions. You can find past episodes, transcripts, and show notes on ecothinkproductions.com/podcast. You can support us by following us on Instagram and Twitter at EcoThink Productions, and join the Patreon on patreon.com/EcoThink. See you next week.